to, I want to review some of the stuff that we went over last Wednesday because we did it more as an introduction to the class. Um, and that's defining psychology and kind of what the goals of psychology are. Um, as we discussed last Wednesday, the kind of the modern definition of psychology, which you can see right here, is the modern definition is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So what we're interested in is using some type of systematic methodology that can be replicated, that can be measured, those types of things, to investigate human behavior specifically. Even though we do use a lot of animal models and those kinds of things, which we'll get into to understand behavior, but behavior are those things that, as an experimenter, I can directly observe. So, examples of crying, reaction time. We could even look at MRI studies where I can see the activity of the brain of an individual. So those are all examples of behavior. Okay. Mental processes are those things that, as an experimenter or a researcher, I don't have direct access to. So I don't have direct access to your memories. I don't have direct access to certain emotional states. Those are all things that I have to go through you to understand. And that's really what we're talking about, is a study of behavior, what we see, and mental processes, those things that are going on internally. Okay. I also mentioned last Wednesday that a lot of psychologists and researchers are arguing that someday we might just be called the study of the brain. Because really we're finding that the seat of the mind, the seat of if you want to put the soul, the seat of behavior and mental processes seems to be related to brain processes and brain explanations. As I mentioned last Wednesday, even in my dissertation where I was measuring people's identity and the strength of their identity as it relates to, for example, being a student, and different emotional states such as loneliness and social connection, I had to have at least a chapter on the associated areas of the brain that are associated with identity and associated with loneliness processes, which are important because they highlight some important things. I think I mentioned last Wednesday, one of the reasons the brain is becoming more and more important is it's kind of in ways debunking a lot of our held theories, such as, for example, the theory of intimate love, which we always had thought is an emotion. And even when you look in your textbook and when we get to that section in this class, there are still a lot of emotionally based love theories. But what our brain is showing us is that love is not an emotion. It doesn't light up in the amygdala, hippocampal area where most emotions can be observed, at least in brain processes. No, it originates within the brain stem, the same area of the brain that controls heart rate, breathing, hunger, and thirst. And so we're learning that we have to modify our theories of intimate love because it seems to be more of a very, very basic human drive and less of an emotional state. Okay. But the reason why I bring this up is because we'll continue to talk about brain processes and associated brain regions as we come to the understanding of the different topics that we'll talk about in this class. I did want to just mention again the origination of the word psychology. It comes from the word psyche, which means mind. And so for centuries, and there's even still definitions that psychology is a study of the mind, being those things that make us conscious, our ability to reflect on the past, our ability to have understand our realities. And it's important to note where the word comes from. It comes from the Greek word, the mind word, or psyche, actually literally translate to the word breath. Because what the Greeks believed is that when we took our first breath, when we came out of mom's stomach, we breathed in our soul, or this thing we call the mind. And then when we take our last breath, we breathe out our soul or our mind. So it literally is this idea of existence and being able to exist from the moment of birth to the moment of death. So, and we will see when we get into developmental psychology, while we know that there's a lot more psychology that we need to talk about prenatally, from conception to birth, we are interested in how the mind operates from the beginning of life to the end of life. And we'll get to a picture of that when we get to developmental psychology, which is how we change over time. Okay. But for now, this is the working definition we'll use as a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Within this scientific study, we have four kind of main goals, and it's to describe, understand, predict, and control. Describe, we just want to give a mental or behavioral phenomenon a name, a definition that separates it in essence from all of the different emotional or psychological states that we have. And then when we get to the understanding part, we want to know what states are necessary to cause a given behavior, to cause a given mental process. Okay. And then once we understand the causal variables, we want to be able to predict or forecast the behavior accurately. And then, of course, especially in the field of clinical and counseling psychology, and especially when it comes to a negative emotional state, we want to know how we can control that so that we can manage things like psychological disorder symptoms. In a field known as positive psychology, we want to know how, through the idea of control, how we can live a better life, how we can be more happy, how we can be more productive. So that's the control aspect of psychology. And through each of the topics we go through in this class, we'll look at each of these different goals as we understand them. So again, when we get to the abnormal section, we'll look at, the description of a psychological disorder, the causal parts of that disorder, who may or may not get that disorder through prediction, and then control is the therapeutic aspects. Well, how can we help people overcome those different disorders? And that's kind of an example of how we're going to go about describing what we're doing in this class. Okay. I want to talk for just a couple minutes about some myths about psychology. First, about psychology as a field. And then I want to go through some myths about information that has been produced in the psychological literature that quite isn't so accurate, to kind of show this is how science works. We update our information as we get more data, and there's a lot of myths out there that have been permeated into our popular culture that really has, in a sense, been debunked. After that, we're going to look at something called pseudopsychologies, which is psychologies that look like psychology. They want to understand, predict, control behavior, but their scientific part of it isn't there. The science proof for these different type of psychologies isn't there. And I'm going to state this right up front. I'll state it. Just because something doesn't have scientific proof now doesn't mean we should just throw it away with the baby's bathwater. That maybe it's just that we don't have the technologies to understand some of the different pseudopsychologies or parapsychologies that are out there. So, but I'll get to that when we get to that section. All right. But to begin, what I want to talk about myths as far as the profession of psychology, and probably one of the biggest myths, especially coming into a class like an introductory class like this one, is psychology is all about mental health disorders and the like. And where does this myth originate? Well, a lot of it originates because a lot of our popular theories came out of the clinical and counseling psychology areas. So we'll look at Sigmund Freud's, we'll look at humanistic theories that did come out of the clinical areas. But part of the fact behind this myth is when we look at the makeup of, say, the American Psychological Association, About 52% of psychologists identify themselves as clinical or counseling psychologists. And so, as far as a field, it is a large portion of people who practice the field. But if you've looked through our syllabus, you'll note that as far as abnormal psychology, disorders, and stuff, it is maybe about 5 to 10% of this total course. What we're going to be focusing on mainly in this class is everyday behavior of all of us, not just those who are suffering from some type of mental or psychological disorder, because that sets us up to understand people who suffer from psychological disorders at the end of the course. Okay. The second myth is psychology is not a science. And this myth, I believe, comes from, the popular adages of psychology. For example, here in the state of Arizona, it's not a title state. So anybody who works within mental health or behavioral health can call themselves a psychologist, even though they don't have any formal training as far as a science is concerned. But I will tell you, as far as my clinical colleagues, they get the same graduate um, um, training that I got as more of a research and applied psychologist. In that the majority of a doctorate degree, when I look at the last couple of years, it was 90 credits, and 70 of the credits were all in research methodology and statistics. And then the only remaining part was in my area of specialty in general psychology. And it's the same with a lot of the clinical trainings as well. So, and even when we get to the clinical section, we will see that it follows the scientific method. You do an assessment, you do interviews, you set up a hypothesis, commonly known as a diagnosis. And then you put up a treatment modality, which is testing your hypothesis. And then you see if the symptoms or the problem abates itself. If it doesn't, you go back to the drawing board. And so even within clinical work we do, even within applied work we do here in the psychology, we use the scientific process. The last myth is psychologists can read minds, and I will admit this to you. This is great fun if you really want to mess with someone. There are times where someone says, "Oh, you're a psychologist, so you're reading your mind." If they annoy me, I go, "Yes, I am, and we need to talk." But the truth of the matter is if a psychologist comes to you, or someone with even a bachelor's degree or less in psychology, and says, I can read your mind, they are full of it. I will actually tell you that a clinically trained psychologist who does clinical assessment is no more good at reading someone's mind or reading someone's mind as a 3-4-year-old. So it makes the same exact error rates. The difference between psychologists, real psychologists, is that we do assessment and we let the data drive how we treat people. We don't use our own interpretation to say, well, this is what I think you're thinking. So yes, it is great fun to mess with some people and say, yes, I'm a psychologist and therefore I'm analyzing you or I'm reading your mind. The truth to be told is if you ever have a psychologist ever tell you that and you're seeing them professionally, go see someone else because they're not being honest with you. Those tend to be the common misconceptions about psychology and what we do as a practice. But I want to go over some myths of findings that tend to still be in psychology. And in fact, I did a review of introductory psychology books, and there's still some of these myths and information about psychological findings, even in textbooks. But I think they're important to go over just to understand that while we have initial results, we're always getting new data to talk about different states. Okay, so topic related myths. You probably always have heard the adage that opposites attract, and it comes from the question, birds of the feather flock together. I can't remember the last part of the other part of it about opposites attract. I apologize. But there's always been this adage that opposites attract and they make stronger, more vibrant relationships. That actually does not work out when we look at relationship satisfaction, when we look at divorce rates, when we look at even violence rates. We find that individuals who are more opposite with each other, it creates more dysfunction in their relationship and more and high, even divorce rates and stuff can be predicted by being attracted to someone opposite than oneself. And so the adage that opposites attract really is a myth. Okay. Lie detectors tests are accurate. This is a big issue within, for example, forensics. Law enforcement love these tools and the like. But I will tell you, there is a reason they're not permissible in court, and it's really because, especially over the last about 13 years, some serious tests of lie detectors have been gone out, and a lie detector actually has about the same error rate as someone just saying whether you're lying or not. It has an error rate of about 40%. And so when we say, well, let's take a lie detector test and that will tell us the truth, that's not actually totally true. Lie detectors have about a 40% error rate. Another myth is ESP, or extra sensory perceptions, the ability to sense things that about others that may be there. We'll get to this one here in just a little while about ESP and different parapsychologies, and so I'm going to leave that one as a question mark, as a pause for a moment. The fourth one is people use only 10% of their brain. Again, this is a myth. Our brain imaging technologies have shown that you're using your complete brain. There's no part of your brain that isn't utilized within a day's process. The whole myth of 10% of our brain is because we only have about a 5 to 10% understanding of the human brain. Meaning, despite all of our technologies and everything else, we're only still scratching the surface of the brain. But the idea that you only use 10% of your brain is a myth. You use it all. Okay. The fifth one is people often repress traumatic childhood memories. The idea of repression is that you purposely forget some trauma that occurred to you in childhood or recently. The truth is we cannot consciously or make a decision to repress memories. And when we get to this section on trauma, when we get to this section on memory and stuff, we'll talk about this a little bit more. There are triggers within the brain system that protect us. And so the brain does have triggers that might make it more difficult for us to access memories. But the idea that you can purposely forget some type of trauma has been shown to be false. At least, and again, when I say false, lacks scientific evidence. And I just want to make that very clear. Okay. The next one is one that I've been interested in because I've been in the education field for a long time, and it's a whole notion of learning styles. Students benefit from teachers catering to different learning styles. Learning style being whether you can prefer to learn from auditory information, written information, tactile information, and the like. And there has been a whole entire industry, and the industry is still strong and good and going, that work with educators to say this is how you should teach your students based on their different preferred learning style. And again, this is one that over the last 13 years, there has been what's called meta-analysis done. A meta-analysis is when we take all of the research in one area and we statistically squish it together. And what we have found is that it is not beneficial to learn in your preferred learning style. Indeed, what we have actually found is that it's better to learn in your least preferred learning style because that forces you to deep process the information. We have found that when people learn in their preferred learning style, retention of the information, accurate interpretation of the information goes way down. And in fact, what the recommendation is today is that if you prefer auditory, you should force yourself to do reading or visual or kinesthetic, because that will force you to deep process the information. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to cognition and decision making and memory. But it is being considered a myth as of right now. It is best to stick to your initial intuition on multiple choice questions. So the idea that you should stick with your first question, and then when you go back, you shouldn't change any answers. The truth behind this one is we actually found that when students do go back and they question the answers that they initially provided, they are statistically more likely to choose the correct answer afterwards. Okay. People who have psychological disorders are prone to violence. This is something that our media has done a horrible job of portraying, the idea that a person who has psychosis or schizophrenic is violent and is prone to violence, and our school shootings are because of people's mental health, or they're suffering from some type of mental illness. The truth is, and I'll use schizophrenia as the best example. Schizophrenia is when people have delusions, disorganized thinking, hallucinations of auditory, visual, or olfactory sources. And we have actually found that if you want to live in the least probable place to experience violence, it would be in a halfway home or a community of individuals who have schizophrenia, because you're less likely to be harmed by someone with this disorder or with a psychosis than you are by your neighbor living next door to you. And when we look at schizophrenics and people with psychosis, when we look at people with psychosis and the like, they're actually less violent. The voices that schizophrenics often heard have to do with self-harm, not harming others. So that's been a myth as well. Cameron, you said, I'm sorry, for initial intuition on multiple choice questions, did you say they get it right before they change their answer or when they go back and change it? The answer is, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear on that, it's when you actually go back and change your answer that statistically you'll get it right when you question whether or not you felt like you got the question right or wrong. The initial literature suggested that going back and changing multiple choice questions make it so you choose the wrong answer because you're not going with your initial intuition. But research since then has shown that when we actually do go back and we question our intuition, we're more likely to get the answer correct. Okay. And then the last one, negative reinforcement means using punishment to change behavior. And I kind of want to leave this for our learning section, but basically the idea that when we remove something positive from someone's environment, that's a punishment, is kind of a misnomer. Actually, it increases behavior. It's meant to increase behavior, not decrease behavior. But I'll make that one more clear when we get to our learning section. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about these myths or ideas? Okay. All right, what I would like to talk about next is pseudopsychologies, and when we talk about pseudos, we mean false. Okay, so pseudopsychology is a false psychology. What we mean of it in this context is they don't use scientific methods to determine someone's behavior or mental process. That doesn't, I want to be careful with this because that doesn't mean that you should just not use them if it's something that works for you or something that helps guide your life. I'm just saying that these are things that we find very little scientific support for. But within each of these, we will find some type of fact, some type of thing that really ties us to these different ideas and really can be grounded within science, but the practice in and of themselves are fairly inaccurate. Okay, so and I'm going to start with probably one of the most best examples of a pseudopsychology, which is called phrenology. And phrenology is this notion that personality traits are revealed by the shape of the skull, meaning that for example, if you have a bump right here at the top of your head, it means that you're probably good at volleyball. Or if you have a lump right here, it means you probably should do some basketball. If you have an indenter here, you probably like country music more than you like punk or jazz, and those kind of different things. This is a kind of a silly one here, but you can see each part. You know, you prefer to study, what type of art you have a preference for, sports, and the like. Um, Phrenology grew out of around the 18th and 19th century, so we're talking 1700s through the 1800s. And it grew out of this idea that the brain has what's called localization of function. And you can tell this functioning by filling the person's skull, because if anybody has been with a newborn or have taken a biology course that deals with birth, you'll know that infants are born with a soft spot. Part of their skull is soft. The true purpose of that soft spot is so that the cranium can go through the vaginal opening of mom without breaking or cracking, and then it starts to soften afterwards. But back in the day, it was believed that the skull was completely soft. So when you came out of mother's womb, your skull kind of conformed to the different areas of your brain. And so you could kind of tell what someone's personalities or intelligence level is by feeling the different areas of the skull. And indeed, you know, we're talking the times before TV and DJs and stuff. And so if you were going to throw a rockin' party, you might hire a phrenologist to come over, and they would tell you how similar you are to, you know, Mariah Carey's brain, or someone famous, by feeling the different areas of your brain, of your skull, to determine that. Okay. So fictional, yes. You can't feel someone's skull and determine what a person's personality is. What did it start in the field of psychology and brain science is that while the skull isn't you can't tell from the skull, but there is what we call localization of functioning within the brain. Okay, and so when we get to the biology section, we will see that the visual area of the brain is in the back of the skull. Our problem solving abilities are in the frontal cortex, and our auditory areas are above just behind our ears, and the like. So well, phrenology, as far as being a science, it did lead us to this notion: is there actual localization of functioning within the brain itself? And the fact is, and when we get to this section in the biology section, we will see that different regions of our brain seem to be specialized in different experiences or functioning that we have. Okay. Um, the second one that I'd like to cover is what's called palmistry. Okay, or palm reading. And this is where you take the different lines of a person's hands and you could tell something about them. So, probably the most famous one is your line of life, how long you're going to live, your love abilities on here, a line of marriage. And the idea is you could look at the different parts and lines in your hand, and it tells you something about you. Okay. Again, scientific evidence for this, not so much. Very little, if none, comes from it. But where does this notion of palm reading come from? It actually originated around 2,000, 3,000 years ago, where a lot of individuals, especially within Western societies, especially within the European, Germanic, and Gaelic areas, were very nature-based. They believed that humans, just like plants and animals and mountains and everything else, are of the earth. We're all from the earth. Okay. And they noticed that, you could tell the health of a plant by the different scars it has on it, by, you could tell how old a tree is by looking at the rings and counting the number of rings. They noticed that when you look at something, you can tell about its health and vitality. And they believe that because usually the areas that get most used kind of show you the most health. So the leaf of a tree, is most likely to show you, and the rings of a trunk, those most used areas. And what is one of the most used areas of the human body? Well, it's our hands. We work with them. We use them all the time. And so they felt that the lines of the hands could tell something about humans and their vitality. So myth, fact. Myth is our hands really don't tell us much as far as the lines are concerned, but there are certain aspects of the human body where we can tell the health of an individual. For example, when we look at the eyes, the whiter the eyes, the healthier the person. We can do lie detecting. There's what's called um, I can't remember the name. Well, there's two incidences where you can look at the dilation of the eye. If you're very, very attracted to someone, and this is one way maybe you could tell when you're dating someone if they're attracted to you, the eye will dilate to 0.7. Whether it's dark or whether it's light, whether it's cloudy, whether it's sunny, when you're really in love with someone, your eye dilation becomes fixed and will not change. And that's why we think that, there's a lot of poems about the lover's gaze, about staring into each other's eyes and the like, because scientifically, the eyes do get a fixed dilation when someone is really, really into you or you're into someone else. We also know that you can use the eyes as a good lie detector. They will actually dilate down and then dilate up the moment the person tells a lie. And actually, the CIA measures that when they interrogate some people in some situations. And so, my point being is that there are, and I'm focused on the eye regions, you can tell a lot about a person by just their physical appearance. The hands, not so much. And we'll talk about different facial expressions as we move on. We'll talk about attraction and those types of things, and what we look for when we're looking at the physical aspects of an individual. And so there is much about the human body that we can tell about someone's psychological state. Just not the hands so much, not so much evidence for that. The third kind of parapsychology, as a good example, is astrology. And this is the position of the stars and the planets that birth determine personality traits and affect your behavior. So first of all, I want to talk about why this is scientifically invalid. Okay. It's scientifically invalid because there's errors in the actual charts. Okay. The astrological charts were developed around 6,000 years ago. And in the last 6,000 years, the stars in the skies have shifted by about 6 months. Okay. So if we're using the astrological signs as a notion of behavior, as an example, based on this, I was born a Leo, but the stars that were in the sky when I was born are 6 months ahead. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The actual stars that were in the sky when I was born are made up of the Aquarius systems. And so my actual astrological sign is actually Aquarius. It's not Leo, because that's not the star constellations that I was born in. And so if we've been reading this, just keep in mind, if you want to know what your actual astrological sign should be based on the stars that were in the sky in your birth, take this and add 6. And that's your actual, those were the stars that were in the sky when you were born. So this is the scientific disproof of astrology, and its use is because it's not scientifically valid based on its theory. But questions have been arisen. Is there something to do with the time you're born and the success in your life? And there are several examples of, yes, when you're born does matter dependent upon where you're headed in life. For example, the best example, and we can find the same thing in baseball, a little bit of football, but hockey, professional hockey. Professional hockey players tend to be born within the month of December through January. And the initial theory is well, that's when it's cold outside, so maybe they have some type of relationship with the weather and the ice and those types of things. But further examination actually shows is because of the cutoffs of when individuals can start playing hockey and being trained by coaches and stuff is in December and January, meaning that people who were born in December or January have anywhere from a 6-month to 12-month advantage of anyone else being born in a different month because of the cutoff of age. Okay. Another good example is diagnoses of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Young children who are born in the month of September have a 34 to 54% more likely chance of being diagnosed with ADHD. But again, is it because of the months they were born or because of life experiences? And what we have suggested is that it has to do with more life experiences, because in most states, the cutoff for entrance into kindergarten, preschool, first grade tend to be in August, which means if you're born in the early months of September, you're going to be much younger than your other classmates, meaning that you're also going to be less developmentally mature. And what we have found is that teachers will evaluate a child's behavior based upon a comparison to the rest of their class. And the rest of the class tend to be within the same developmental area than children who were born in late August and September. And so because of their immaturity and behavior, teachers tend to judge them as more likely having ADHD, and that those children end up getting the diagnosis of ADHD. And so something to keep in mind, it's a social comparison thing, okay? So is there things to be said about when we're born and the life experiences we have and successes? Yes, there are. Those were just two examples. We can go on with other examples, but I think the point being is when we're born is important, but it is really dependent upon the life experiences we'll have, whether we'll have an advanced experience, for the example in pro hockey, or if we'll be experiencing a deficit experience, such as being born in the month of August and September, when we see the cutoffs for education or entrance into education. So this is an example of, does it really have to scientifically do with the position of the stars? No, because that's actually inaccurate. But does when we're born and whatnot determine some of our outcomes? Absolutely, especially when we're in comparison to other people. Okay. All right. So does everyone have an understanding about kind of the difference between when we're talking about scientific finding and but versus these other kind of parapsychologies? Um, if you want to make some extra money on the weekend, I will tell you, as far as palm readers and fortune tellers, there's a really good short book. It's about 100 pages. It's called The Real Sherlock Holmes. And it tells you all of the little secrets and all of the little things that fortune tellers use and whatnot to predict the individual's behaviors, or to at least have people believe that their behaviors are being predicted. So if you want to put up a little tent on campus and make a few extra bucks, I would recommend that book. Again, it's called The Real Sherlock Holmes. It's a very interesting read, and it kind of tells us the different things that parapsychologists use in order to try and predict and determine individual behavior. So, any questions on that? Okay. All right, I don't want to skip that because what I want to finish class today, because I want to be able to, when we get into Thursday, get into the different camps of psychology. So, talking about the different areas: social psychology, developmental psychology, and different thoughts within psychology. I really want to focus today on some of the classical problems of psychology, because psychology did grow out of philosophy, and we have taken on a lot of the questions that still vex philosophers and psychologists and even anthropologists and social scientists such as sociologists today. These answers are still of great debate, but I want everyone to kind of have that kind of philosophical understanding of the things we try to answer within psychology and really inform us about where we're headed. Okay. And this is not an exhaustive lecture on these issues. I'm using some cherry picked examples. Um, so, Cameron, your question about 34 to 54%, it is a myth that those children have ADHD. It's more of an error in diagnosis, because what we find is when ADHD is diagnosed, it's diagnosed based on the cohort of the child. And when we're born in those cutoff months, we have less developmental maturity than our colleagues within our same classroom. We're at a 12-month disadvantage, so we're more likely to fidget in our seats and have less attention abilities and those types of things. And so it's more of an error in chart, an error in diagnosis, as far as those who are reporting it and bringing it out. Okay. All right. The first classical problem or philosophical problem that we've taken on in psychology is what we call the nature versus nurture debate. Um, and the two who are a good example of this are Plato and Aristotle, who were Greek philosophers. They were students of Socrates. For those, I think I noticed that there were some students in here interested in going to law, which you'll learn what's called the Socratic method, where you question and question and question until you come to an ultimate conclusion. A lot of attorney schools, that's what you spend most of your time doing, is a Socratic method of conversation until you reach what's called the ultimate truth. And that was really the Socratic method. When Socrates died, there were two students who were assuming that they would take over his school. The one was Plato, the other one was Aristotle. But when Socrates passed away, he passed his school down to Plato, and Aristotle became disillusioned and left the school. And this is where there's going to be two different experiences that lead to two different ideas about the nature of human beings. Okay. Plato is going to take the nature approach. He's going to look at the world and say that in our world, there's a place for individuals, that a baker's child is more likely to become a baker, that a king's son is more likely to become the next king. A peasant tends to stay a peasant. And what he believed is based on this, that traits, who we are is inherited, that things run through our bloodline. Okay. Today, the people who go with the nature perspective, we can use the word genetics. How much of your nature, how much of you are you born with based on your genetic material? Okay. And in Plato's argument is he went completely on the nature end, because this was his argument of why kings should be kings, rulers should be rulers, peasants should be happy with their position in life, because that's their nature, that's what they're born with, and that we have to fulfill that duty of our life because that's what we're born with. That is a pure nature approach. If you think everything is inherited, everything can be found within your genetic code, and that determines who you are and your place in the world, you are on the nature end of this debate. Okay. Aristotle is going to have a different experience. He's going to leave the Socrates school, and he's going to do traveling, and he's going to become really one of our first naturalists, and one of our first really kind of modern scientists. He's one of the very first who started to categorize animals and plants. So, what makes up a dog, what makes up a cat, what differentiates a fern from a flower. That categorization all started with Aristotle. And what Aristotle is going to make a different interpretation of a person's nature or experience than Plato is, based on his observations of nature. He's going to observe, for example, if a plant doesn't have sufficient light, if a plant does not have sufficient water, if the plant doesn't have sufficient nutrients, it will fail to thrive. If a tree that is a desert plant is planted in an alpine region, it will not survive. And he's going to argue that this is because the environment, the world, determines its outcome. And so he's going to take the approach that it is actually life experience. What we experience in life determines who we are. So how our parents treated us, how society treats us and educates us, what happens in education. All of those experiences determine who we are, not what we're born with. We're not born with a disposition, is what Aristotle's going to argue. And so, in our modern times, if you are a strong believer that an individual can change who they are despite their genetics, if you have a very strong belief in education, and you have a strong belief that the world and what you learn in it and you experience determines more of who you are than, say, what you're born with, you're on the heavy end of the nurture debate. Okay. And I will tell you, this debate is still going on in modern psychology, with the advent of the understanding the genome and different areas of genetics and stuff. We're becoming much more appreciative of the nature aspect of human existence. But throughout this course, we'll talk about different notions of how much of someone is nature versus nurture. And we usually use what's called the genetic quotient to kind of state these things. So, for example, when we get to personality, personality is kind of what makes you uniquely you. Are you outgoing or are you reserved? Do you prefer being with people or yourself? Are you conscientious or not conscientious? Are you tightly wound, or are you easygoing? Those types of things we use what's called a genetic quotient to determine. And I will say that your personality, again, this is why it's still a debate, because we don't have exact numbers. But for example, dependent upon the research study you read, about 20% to about 60% of your personality is determined by genetics, with the other portion being attributed to your life experience. But note the variation dependent upon the study that's being conducted. I mean, we're 20 to what did I say, 70 or 60%, something like that. I apologize. But we're talking about a 30% deviation that we haven't been able to narrow down on. I liken this to, I do that, what is that, ancestry.com, and they constantly are messaging me saying, hey, we've learned something new about you. Your nostrils flare or not flared or something like that. Do you prefer meat or do you prefer vegetables? And I think it's interesting to go on there because those percentages are constantly changing. And so even within, things like ancestry.com, where they've sampled literally millions of people, new data continually changes where they came from. Originally with that one, it said I mostly originated from England, but now I mostly originate from Eastern Russia and Eastern Prussia. So my point being is that this is still a debate because the science itself isn't refined enough to give us a really good detailed picture. And so that is why this is still a debate today about how much does nurture and nature contribute. We will see when we get to things like mental disorders and stuff, it definitely is an interaction that you can have a genetic predisposition to, for example, depression or some other type of psychological disorder, but it requires an environmental trigger, something in the environment and experience that triggers that disorder, much like physical disorders such as diabetes and the like, which usually requires some type 2 diabetes, which requires some type of lifestyle or something that then created that disorder. So much like a lot of our physical health issues, we're finding the same thing with psychological health issues. Okay. The second debate I want to talk about is the mind-body problem. Mind-body problem comes two good examples are Rene Descartes and John Locke, who were two early philosophers. And the real mind-body problem are the mind and body one and the same, monistic viewpoint, or are the mind and the body separate, meaning that we have a mind and we have a body and they operate separately from them? Okay. And we're going to see two different arguments. Descartes is going to give a dualistic interpretation. Basically, he's going to take it from his walks through German gardens. In these German gardens, there used to be statues, and if you stepped on a certain stone, the hydraulics in from stepping on that stone would make the statue move in some way. And from that, he's going to argue that the body cannot operate on its own, that it has to have some type of actor acting upon it, just like a car, a machine, a computer, a robot. There has to be some type of something acting upon it to make it work, okay? And so he's going to argue that there's this thing we call the mind. If we want to use the word soul, we could use that word as well. And that sits within the human system, and it's basically acting as an operator of the body. But without it, you can't have the body. You can't have an operating body. The body is basically the car. The mind is basically the driver. He's going to put it in a strange place. He'll put it in the pituitary gland, which is one of the irregularly shaped components of the brain, which actually is located in the center of the brain area, which makes sense. But as we'll learn, the pituitary gland has probably not as much control over us as we think it does, other than our hormonal reactions to things. But he's going to argue that the mind and the body are two separate entities. John Locke is going to argue something different. He's going to argue the mind and the body are one and the same, but it's going to be more of a political argument, okay? If Thomas Jefferson submitted the Declaration of Independence to this class as an assignment and put it through our plagiarism system, I would actually have to give him a 0 on the Declaration of Independence, because most of the Declaration of Independence was plagiarized from John Locke's writings on the freedom of human beings, okay? It was actually John Locke who stated that we're all born with the liberty and the rights and whatever it is, I forget the first part of the Declaration of Independence, that we're all born equal, okay? But what does it require for us all to be born equal? Well, according to John Locke, that means we all have to be born the same. In his notion, we are all born with blank slates, for which experience writes upon. If we were to put it in the modern terms, we are all born with blank hard drives, for which once we start operating in the world, the software and the everything is then installed, okay? That's kind of Locke's notion, because if we're not born with a blank slate, we're not all born equal. And so he argued that we're all born with nothing, and it's experience that really tells us who we are. And therefore, we don't have a mind. The mind cannot exist in this scenario. You'll notice that it sounds very much like Aristotle's nurture argument, and he did use a lot of Aristotle's arguments when creating this argument. So for John Locke, there is no mind, there is just the body, okay? So again, where are we with this debate? Well, again, we're going to have to say we don't know. If we look at biological evidence, such as brain research, and when a certain area of the brain goes away, the person seems to lose functioning. But on the other hand, if you take a perfectly healthy body that has been passed away, it's no longer, they passed away, they're no longer alive, you can't bring them back to life, even though they have a fully functioning brain and heart, and you can revive it, and you could put them on artificial life support. But once the body is gone, it seems that it's gone. There's nothing that can bring it back. And so that's the argument that while there has to be a mind component in this argument from the biological areas, I talked a little bit last week about our issues with consciousness, which also still stirs this mind body debate, where our limitations of our knowledge of the brain is we do understand that it's kind of that hardware that we use to generate thoughts and behaviors. It's the electrical wiring, those types of things. But our actual experiences we can't identify within the brain. We don't know where our video screen is or our auditory speakers are at. We don't know, those areas of the brain have not been identified. So how do we experience what our hardware is generating for us? That's part of consciousness that we don't understand. And so the mind-body problem still exists. We will see if we get into other types of psychologies, such as indigenous psychologies, Native American psychologies, post-colonial psychologies, there is a lot of argument that there is still the existence of a soul that is necessary for us to have a full and complete human experience. And so this is still much of an argument. Again, if you're on the mechanical end of psychology, where you think that the brain can explain everything, you're taking more of a monistic approach. If you think that there's more to life than brain processes, there's something there that helps drive these different systems. You're more on the dualistic end. When it comes to psychology, the complete and truthful, honest answer is we've only scraped the surface of the brain. We've only scraped the surface of what we understand about consciousness. And so this one is still up for heavy debate as we move forward. All right. I think this is the last two, and then I think we can call it good for today, because I think I probably overwhelmed you all with these different arguments. Okay. Probably a very important one, especially in our modern times, with things like gun shootings, school shootings, the violence we see in our world, the destruction we've seen through the 20th century with all the wars and whatnot that we've seen, is what is the nature of man, or what is the nature of humans? Are we born bad, selfish, self-interested? Or are we born good? Are we born pro-social? Are we born wanting to help? Okay. And the kind of the two philosophers that kind of highlight this point again, we can look at Hobbes, and who was an English philosopher, and we could look at Rousseau, who was a French philosopher, and they're going to do much like what Aristotle and Plato did. They're going to look at the world, and they're going to look how it's structured and how it is, and they're going to make some interpretation about the nature of human beings, or the nature of man as it was originally put. What Hobbes is going to look at is he's going to look at the world, and he's going to look at nature, and he's going to see volcanoes, he's going to see tornadoes, he's going to see thunderstorms. So you're going to see all of these destructive forces within the world. And he's going to argue that the world is destructive. Man is like the world, therefore man is destructive, therefore his nature is bad. Okay. I'm giving kind of the very basics of this argument. There's much more depth into this, but this is kind of the basics of it. Rousseau is going to look at the world, and just like Aristotle, he's going to see something nature. He's going to see a balance in nature. He's going to see birth to death, and how even when we have a prey versus victims, where he's going to see the symmetry. Animal eats another animal. That animal then defecates, which creates vegetation for that animal to offspring to eat. Anyways, he's going to see, volcanoes create land, that storms replenish the earth with water, and he's going to see, instead of destruction, he's going to see growth, and goodness. And so he's going to argue that the basic nature of man is good. Um, Now, both of these philosophies have had a huge influence on things like criminology, legal systems, and the way we conduct ourselves. Okay, so for example, Hobbes' philosophy is going to take off in England and here in the United States, where we have a criminal justice system that is meant to squash the worst nature of human beings. That the reason why we need a legal system is because people have a natural propensity to do bad things. And so we need law, we need legal order, we need to punish any bad behavior. We have to repress it. Okay. So here in the United States, it's very much as someone does someone, we use a punishment model, we separate them from society, we do all of those things. We try to make their lives miserable and kind of say, well, if you didn't do that, you wouldn't have to be doing this, and it's because you're a bad person that this has become who you are. However, when we look at places like Denmark, Finland, and places like that, we see more of Rousseau's argument. If you look at many of the jails and the prisons in places like Denmark and Finland, they're more kind of like resorts. The living quarters are very comfortable. There's therapies, there's massages, there's abilities to expand your knowledge and your experiences. They don't use a punishment model, they use a growth model, because what they argue is people become bad. Rousseau argued this. Rousseau argued people do bad things because they deviate from their most basic nature. And when we deviate from nature, that's when we start to make bad decisions, or we start to hurt other people. So the basis of the criminal justice system is to bring a person back to their most basic nature. Okay. Now, which system is correct? Which system is wrong? One way we can measure this is recidivism rates. And so if we look at recidivism rates here in the United States and England, so this is the recidivism is the probability of somebody going back to prison after their first offense. So they get out and they reoffend and they end up. In the United States, the average is around 60%. So the probability of returning back to prison after your first go through is about 60%. Okay. In countries such as Denmark and Finland, recidivism rates are less than 10%. Okay. So here we have two different models, two different ways of thinking of the way, the nature of man. One is a punishment model, a repression model. One is bringing people back to who they are, bringing them back to nature. And we see a huge difference in things like recidivism rate and whether people actually want to go back or not. Believe it or not, people choose not to go back to a Finland or Denmark jail because they want to exist and be a part of the world. Whereas when we use punishment models, we tend to see higher rates of criminality coming out of our systems. Now, I am going to say that there has been a lot of reform here in the United States. We still have a long ways to go, but our correction systems have been slowly improving. I'll mention later in the course when we talk about different topics like this. I did consult as a therapist for a women's prisons for several years, and assisted with mental health issues, assisted with addiction issues and family issues. And so we are becoming more aware that we need to help people come back to their better natures, to help them overcome problem states. But we still maintain in our legal system this idea that people's nature needs to be repressed and punished. But those are the two arguments on the nature of man, and we'll look at both of these as we move forward. And maybe by the end of the course, I know we have a lot of forensic and criminal people interested in criminology in this class, and so I think this will be an interesting debate that we can have over the course of the semester. The last thing that I just wanted to mention, and it's less of a philosophical debate, but rather of approach to understanding psychology, and this is the debate between structuralism versus functionalism. Structuralism came from the guy who's named for being the father of scientific psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, who he's given the title of father of scientific psychology because he was one of the first to establish a lab at a university in Germany. And then the other person within this debate is William James, and he's considered the father of American psychology because he was really one of the very first to write formal textbooks within the field. And he gave a lot of lectures across the United States and really gained interest among universities to promote the advancement of psychology here in the United States. I will tell you, during my graduate years, I had to read James's work as part of my education still even today. But Wundt and James are going to come up with two different ways to understand human behavior. Wundt is going to come up with what he calls structuralism. And what he argued is that we understand the mind when we understand the structure, okay? William James says, the structure, okay, but what we really should be exploring is what is a function of behavior? What is a function of happiness? What is a function of emotions? What is a function of memory? Because knowing the structure doesn't understand its purpose, okay? And I'm just going to bring this out today, and we'll end with this today. If you feel like knowing that the amygdala becomes active when we're experiencing certain type of emotions such as anger and the like, and that explains anger, that the amygdala is being active, then you're a structuralist because you feel like the structure of that brain component explains that human behavior. If, on the other hand, you ask questions like, what is the function of anger? Why do we get angry? Not based on the structure that becomes active, but why, what purpose does it serve? You're a functionalist. And again, today I'll mention my dissertation one more time. We kind of take both approaches. I had to explain the structures within the brain that become active when we experience loneliness or social connection, but I also had to explain what the function of loneliness and identity are within that interpretation. But I just wanted to note the difference between these two. Okay. I think I've done way too much talking for today. So I think we're going to end today. What we're going to get into this coming Thursday is we're going to look at different camps. So we're going to look at Sigmund Freud's understanding of the unconscious mind. We're going to look at behaviorism and why we behave the way we behave based on experience. We're going to look at the humanistic approach, which is the idea of why are we motivated to be in this classroom? What is the theories behind that? We'll look at things like social psychology and the importance of the situation and determining behavior. We'll look at the camp of developmental psychology and how it explains how we change experiences over time. We'll look at what's called the cognitive revolution, which is how do brain processes, decision-making processes influence our behavior. And we'll end with a biological approach, which is, what activity within the brain can explain different behaviors. And we'll end with different types of psychologists, from experimental to personality to clinical psychologists, which will really be the basis of your first assignment about exploring different areas of psychology and how that differently explains how that can inform your career choice. Okay. All right. So I am going to stop.